I'm going to be talking about share of search as a brand metric. Now, obviously, traditionally, marketers have tended to use survey data for their brand tracking, data based on questionnaires. But anyone who knows me will know I'm a bit skeptical about that kind of data. I'm very fond of the David Ogilvy quote. He said that the trouble with that kind of research is that people don't do what they say, don't say what they think, and don't think how they feel. So over the last 30 years or so working in this field, I found that the relationship between conventional brand tracking metrics and actual purchase and buying behavior is often surprisingly weak. And that's one of the reasons why I'm always on the lookout for new ways to track brands and advertising. And in particular, over the last few years, looking at ways of tracking brands and advertising based on what people do rather than what they say, and specifically what they do online. And that, of course, is where Google comes in. I mean, everybody knows that Google's a powerful tool for marketing, but I think it's now becoming much more realized that Google is potentially a rich source of data for market research, data on what people are doing, to some extent on what they're thinking and feeling, and crucially, obviously, on what they're going to buy, on what their intentions are. In fact,
yes,
Google likes
to... Can I just interrupt for a moment? Not everybody can see your screen.
Ah, okay. Right, let me just... okay, sorry.
Great.
Well, you're very lucky because I've shown nothing of any interest so far. Okay, so Google like to talk about themselves as the world's biggest database of human intentions. I think in particular, I've been interested in this idea of using Google search data as a window onto human intentions. And that's where this new metric, share of searches, comes in. Now, when I say share of searches, I don't mean share of paid search advertising, which is one misconception that needs to be cleared up straight away. I mean share of organic search queries. We're looking not at what people do in the way of search advertising, we're looking at what ordinary people are looking for online. The way that we do this for a brand is as follows. This is what the metric looks like. Share of searches is the searches for your brand as a percentage of all searches for all brands in your category. So how do you get that? The first thing you need to do is to gather up historic data on searches for different brands in the category over time. An easy way to get some data on that is to use Google Trends. Now, Google Trends gives you data going, in most cases, all the way back to 2004. It will give you data on lots of the brands in your category. It will give you data that's high frequency, so it's, you know, you can get it weekly, and it's free, which I think is fantastic. The idea that, you know, at the click of a mouse, you can get 16 years worth of data on your brand and on your competitors for free is amazing, and that's probably one of the things that excites me most about all this, is just how easy it is to produce the data. Now, anyone who's experimented with it will know one problem straight away, which is that the data you get from Google Trends is indexed. You don't get the raw search volumes. But as long as all the figures that you get are indexed on the same basis, then they're comparable, I think. And therefore, you can produce this index of an index, if you like, this share of searches. So gather up all the search data for your brand, gather up all the searches for all the other brands you compete with, add them together to get a measure of the overall number of searches in the category, divide one by the other, and that's your share of searches. And James Hankins in the third section will talk a little bit more about the practicalities of doing that. But it's relatively there is an art to it, but it's not too complicated to produce some data that makes good sense. Now, what I did a while ago was to do in-depth analysis of the relationship between the share of search metric and, on the one hand, market share, and on the other, advertising. And I did that in 3 product categories. The first was automotive, new car buying behavior. This is a particularly useful category in that we happen to have access to market share data over a very long time period for that brand, which allows us to really interrogate long-term effects. And that's what excites me most, by the way, about share of search as a metric, is that because we have such long runs of data, it allows us to interrogate long-run marketing and advertising effects. And anyone who knows me will know that I'm all about the long term. So we have a great data source on the car market, and that's been one of the most important ones we've looked at. But it's important to look at other categories which have shorter purchase cycles, things that are a bit more commoditized. So we looked at electricity and gas, power consumption. So that's a much more short-term, price-sensitive, commoditized category. And then the third category that we looked at was mobile phones, mobile phone handsets in particular, which is somewhere in between the two. Now, as I say, in these 3 categories, we've looked at the data in great detail using econometric modeling. So this is not just, comparing share of search with a few graphs. We've built detailed mathematical models that look at the relationships using multiple regression. Now, not everybody needs to do that, but using econometrics allows us to interrogate the relationships between advertising, search, and sales in a lot more detail. And that's what I really wanted to get across today in this longer presentation, is that there is quite a lot of detail in there, a lot of complexity and subtlety, that it's hard to explain in the short presentation that I did last time, or any of the short articles and sound bites that are floating around. So let me talk you through it. Okay, so the first thing we find is that there is clearly a relationship between share of search and market share in each of these 3 categories. And as James and other people have found, we see similar relationships in other categories beyond these 3. So here's what it looks like in automotive. So each dot here represents one brand over a period of 10 years from 2004 to 2014. So on the x-axis, we have the share of brand searches that we were talking about. And on the y-axis, we have the share of cars sold, so market share. So for example, the top right, we have the data for Ford, and that looks at the average share of search over the whole 10-year period versus the average share of search, share of market over the whole 10-year period. Clearly, there's a good relationship between these 2. And I showed this chart in the last presentation. But what this hides is actually just how much data we have underneath this, because we actually have monthly data on market share for each of these brands over the whole 10-year period. We have weekly data on share of search over the whole of this period, which gives us actually, at the monthly level, it gives us about 3,000 data points. Now, we've experimented with this data on a monthly basis, annual basis, quarterly basis. And what we find is, for the 3 categories as a whole, the best relationships are found by looking at quarterly data. Here's the quarterly data for the car market. So that's expanding that data that you saw in the previous chart. So we've got here, each dot now represents one brand in one quarter. And you begin to see now with all this extra data, just how strong the relationship between share of search and share of market really is. We've got here about 1,000 data points. This way of dealing with data is called pooling. You take all the data for all the brands in the category and put all those observations together to produce a mega data set that looks across all the different brands. And there's an econometric technique called pooled econometrics, which allows you to use econometric modeling to get the maximum amount of information about these large data sets of pooled data. To give you an idea, across the three categories, all the pooled data that we have at the quarterly level equates to having 300 years of data, if you see what I mean. When you look at, the number of brands we're looking at, the number of observations, it's like having a data set where you look at one brand over a 300-year period. And that really enables us to interrogate the relationship between share of search and share of market, and later, as you'll see later, between advertising and share of search in much more detail than you could ever do with a non-econometric technique. It also takes a fuck of a long time. So it took, each of these three analyses took about, well, I think the three analyses in all took something like 2 years to do. That's why it's only been done on these three, is it's very, very long and time consuming. But what it does is it teaches us about how the metric works and therefore what we might be able to do with the metric and how robust it is. So what do we find? Well, clearly there is a relationship, a correlation between share of search and share of market, as you can see in this chart, but that's not enough. And it's not that interesting. What is interesting is that changes in share of search correlate with changes in market share. And crucially, changes in share of search precede changes in market share. In other words, share of search is a leading indicator for market share. Now, I'm not going to say that share of searches causes market share. I think that's too simplistic. It's a leading indicator. It correlates with market share, but in advance. I am very cautious about saying whether or not it causes market share. I think I actually would say it doesn't cause market share. What it does is share of searches are a way of tracking people's interest in a brand. They're a proxy, I would say, for something like brand salience or brand consideration. They're close. I think it's a metric that's closely related to sort of interest in the brand at the top of the purchase funnel. It's that interest that is a causal factor in sales, and share of searches is a proxy for that interest. So it's a leading indicator, not necessarily a causal factor. Now, what we find is that, as I say, changes in share of search in any given period correlates with changes in market share some way down the line. This is what it looks like in automotive. What I've done here is, if you look at the raw, 920 data points that we have in this particular chart, the chart looks quite messy. So what I've done is I've grouped those 920 data points into 10 observations, 10 deciles, each representing 92 observations. So the dot at the bottom left is the 92 observations with the biggest drop in share of search. The dot at the top right is the 92 observations with the biggest increase in share of search, and so on. So each of those 10 dots represents a tenth of the sample. And when you group the data in this way, it's a standard way of grouping very messy data in order to make correlations visually apparent. You can see that there is this very close correlation between changes in share of search, in this case, over the last 9 months, and changes in market share that follow. In fact, this correlation is so significant that we can be over 99% confident that it is a genuine correlation. 99.9 something, I think, is a very strong correlation indeed. And we see very similar relationships with equally strong correlations and equally strong statistical significance in mobile telephony and in energy. In each case, share of search is a leading indicator of market share. And what surprised me, I think, when I looked at this data is actually the lead times, at least for these three categories, can be quite long. What we found is for cars, share of searches leads market share by up to 12 months. With phones, it's sort of up to 6 months. With energy, it's up to 3 months. So variation between these categories, but these are surprisingly long lead times. I mean, the idea of using search data as a leading indicator for purchases is not new in search marketing and digital marketing, but typically online marketers have thought of it as something that leads purchase by at most a few days. So in online marketing, you know, if I Google some product or maybe search for something on Amazon, then over the next few days, I'll often be hit with programmatic advertising because digital marketers think I'm about to buy sometime in the next day or so. So that idea of leading by a few days is fine. That's quite standard. What I think people have not realized is that search behavior can be a leading indicator for purchases up to a year ahead. And I don't think digital marketers have tended to look at that in the past. These patterns only really become apparent when you look at very long runs of search data. And crucially, if you smooth the data out to remove lots of the short-term noise. And James will be talking about that sort of smoothing technique in his section. So I think this is one of the ways in which this is very different from the way in which search data has been used by most people up until now. So that's fantastic, but it now becomes slightly more complicated because as a number of people have pointed out, one of the main things that determines search behavior is the size of the customer base. And in fact, what we find is that the relationship goes two ways. People who already own a product or who've just bought a product often search for that product online. So if I buy a Volkswagen car, then for the next few years, I'm likely to be searching for Volkswagen from time to time because I'll be looking for where to get it serviced or how to open the boot or some other feature of the car, or looking for spare parts or accessories and things like that. So many searches are driven by market share. And as we'll see later on, the biggest single thing determining the sort of base level of searches in the category is how big the brand is and how big the customer base is. But equally, people search for the things that they might buy in the future. So share of searches is also a leading indicator for share of market. So share of market affects share of searches, but share of searches is a leading indicator for where share of market will go next. So that means that share of search has two uses in research, in my opinion. On the one hand, to a large extent, share of search is a proxy for market share. If you're ignoring the fine details of the movements, then share of search gives you an idea of where your share of market probably has been heading. That's actually surprisingly useful for some brands. If you're a brand, a traditional FMCG brand that's got good Nielsen data, you don't need anyone to tell you what your share of market is. You've already got that data. But many businesses these days have no clear idea of how they're performing relative to the market because retail audit data doesn't exist in their category. This is particularly true for many online businesses. So using share of searches simply as a proxy for market share, as a way of, if you like, now casting your market share, is a very interesting idea. Some of you may have seen, for example, that Uber Eats, Just Eat used share of search data in their recent communication with their shareholders as a way of tracking their market share versus Uber Eats and Deliveroo. So they could actually show, in their case, that share of searches and share of sales in their category correlated together. And so they could use share of searches to kind of track how they were doing against Uber Eats and Deliveroo. But then the other way of using share of searches is to use it as a leading indicator for where market share will go next. That's probably most likely to be useful in categories where the purchase cycles are long and where purchases are pre-planned, like, for example, new car buying behavior. And again, those categories are becoming more and more important in the world we live in today. The FMCG, the sort of the typical less pre-planned impulse type purchases that were the meat and drink of marketing in the 1970s. FMCG is now a much smaller part of the world of marketing. It's probably less than a quarter of marketing ad spend these days. Increasingly, the things that matter in the world of marketing are much bigger purchases, services, tech, B2B, things that are pre-planned, where this idea of having a leading indicator has more traction. Okay, so now the next thing to think about is a bit more about this relationship between share of search and share of market. It's not quite as simple as to say that a brand's share of search and its share of market just track one another. They're not, that share of search equals share of market. That's not quite that simple. What we find is that the relationship between share of search and share of market is slightly different for each brand, even within a category. Typically, the relationship in the long run will look like this. This is the relationship, for example, for Ford in the car market. So that what we find is there's a sort of equilibrium line. Whoops, sorry about that. Yeah, okay, so there's an equilibrium line, the blue line here. And if you sit on this line, then your share of searches and your share of market are in balance with one another, and your brand will tend to be stable. Now, that line doesn't go through the origin. So that what we find is for each brand, what we find is within a category, each brand, the line typically has a similar slope, so that the relationship between changes in share of search and changes in market share is similar for all brands. But each brand has a different base level. What does the base level mean? Well, the base level basically means that it's the share of market that you get even if people aren't searching for you much. It's a kind of measure of the intrinsic interest in a brand that a brand gets, even if people aren't searching for them very much. So this that's slightly different from the idea that share of search just equals market share. So at any given level of market share, there's a kind of equilibrium level of share of searches, and if your share of searches is below that equilibrium level, your share of market will tend to fall. And if your share of searches is above that equilibrium level, your share of market will tend to rise. Those of you who are familiar with share of voice theory will recognize this kind of relationship, this idea that there's an equilibrium line, and that if your share of search is above that equilibrium line, you'll grow. That's very similar to the relationship between share of voice and share of market. That's why I think Mark Ritson famously said recently that share of search is the new share of voice. He wasn't quite right. Share of search doesn't replace share of voice, because share of search is an intermediate metric, whereas share of voice is a marketing input. And as you'll see in the second section, share of voice is still important and still relevant. Now, what we find is that this equilibrium type relationship means that the two metrics mostly tend to move together for most brands most of the time. So here's an example. I showed this in my previous presentation. This is from mobile telephony. And what we see is for this brand, which is LG, there's a strong correlation between share of searches and share of market. When one goes up, the other goes up, and when one goes down, the other goes down. But crucially, one leads the other. So what we see here is that if you look closely at the two charts, the two lines, the blue line leads the orangey line by about 6 months. And that's the bit that's really interesting. So in this particular case, share of searches for LG was rising over time, and then share of market was following it up. And then around about the middle of the chart there, share of searches began to drop for LG. And then about 6 months later, share of market began to fall down after it. And that's obviously very exciting because it suggests, as I say, that share of searches is a leading indicator and might have some predictive power under some circumstances. Now, one way of analyzing this data in an informal way without using econometrics is to pay attention to the gap between share of search and share of market, which I call ESOS, or extra share of search, in a very similar way to the concept of ESOV, extra share of voice. Because, as I say, these two metrics tend to move together. What's really interesting is when they're not in sync with one another. So if share of search is above share of market, you can expect some growth. If share of search is below share of market, you can expect a bit of a decline. So let's take the data in this chart and subtract one trend from the other to produce ESOS. So that's the blue line in this chart. That's the ESOS, the gap between share of search and share of market. And now compare that against the rate of growth in market share, which is the orange line in this chart. Now you can see why I'm really quite excited about this as a predictive metric. The gap between share of search and share of market, the ESOS, correlates incredibly closely with the rate of growth in market share, but it leads it by 6 months. ESOS predicts growth 6 months ahead in this case. Now, I've chosen this particular chart because it's this particular data series, this particular brand, because it's nice and straightforward and simple. Have I just chosen a one-off? Is this a fluke? I'd say not. So what we did was we looked at the 23 brands in the car market, and we found very similar relationships for 22 of the 23 brands. These little charts show you some of the examples of that ESOS versus growth. And what I've done here is I've shifted the two lines so that they're over time, so that they're in sync with one another. So you can just visually see this relationship between ESOS and growth. It works for 22 out of 23 brands in the car market and for 10 out of 12 brands in the mobile market. You know, this is exciting stuff, I think. We've got a relatively simple early warning system, if you like, for looking at for predicting growth in these two categories. As I say, econometrics allows you to get really detailed detailed readings of the relationship between share of search and share of market in a category. But this simple ESOS graphical technique allows ordinary people, planners, you know, with Excel, to kind of fiddle about with this stuff themselves. And that's, again, another thing that excites me about all this is, as somebody put it, I think it was Frank Cassidy said this is about democratizing market research. You don't need expensive data. You don't need complicated tools. What you need is Google Trends, Excel, and a brain. I'm not in the business of selling, you know, complicated bits of software. I want the marketing community to pick this stuff up and do exciting and interesting things with it. You'll notice that I talked about how well it works in cars and how well it works in mobile, and I haven't talked about energy. I'm going to come back to energy in a bit because energy is slightly more problematic. But it does hold out the hope that, you know, for some brands at least, in these long purchase categories, these planned purchases with long purchase cycles, we might be able to use share of search as a sort of early warning system. And we tried this out in the car market. So we worked very closely with Volkswagen, and we used this over a couple of years to predict what was going to happen to Volkswagen's market share over time. So you can see here the forecasts of the dotted blue line, the red line is what actually happened. And you can see over sort of 2012, 13, 14, over those 3 years, this simple technique was able to do very well at predicting Volkswagen's market share. Were we lucky with Volkswagen? To some extent, but we also had a model which could actually predict market share for the top 6 brands in the category. And overall, it was able to do a very good job of predicting market share movements over those top 6 brands over on a quarterly basis, actually, over a period of a couple of years. When you're assessing forecasting power, it's not enough to just, say we got it right within the margins of error. What you really want to do is to prove that your forecasting method is better than rival forecasting methods. So what we did was we compared the share of search forecasts against a range of other what I would call naive forecasting methods. So you could say, okay, well, let's just assume that your market share next quarter is the same as the last quarter. Well, as you can see here, we beat that very simple search forecasting method. We're about twice as accurate. So this is the forecasting error for our quarterly forecasts in one particular quarter here. So we beat that one. Another one would say, well, we could say, let's assume that the quarterly trend keeps going. We did a lot better than that. Well, we can have a 2-quarter trend. We could look at how things have been going over the last 6 months. We beat that. Or a 3-quarter trend, or a 4-quarter trend. All the simple methods for predicting market share used just by extrapolating from trends. We beat all of those every quarter for all the top 6 brands. It all becomes slightly more problematic when you get down to the level of very small brands, because there's a lot more noise in the data. But clearly, this method has some genuine predictive power, but it's not perfect. And Volkswagen, again, illustrates a very important limitation of this technique, because not long after we started using this technique, Volkswagen got himself involved in some bad PR, the emissions scandal. And bad PR really screws up your search data. So when the news got out that Volkswagen had been, shall we say, somewhat fast and loose with its testing data, and there was lots of bad press about it, lots of people were searching for news of the story. They were searching to find out if their car was affected. They were searching to find out whether there was going to be a product recall. They were searching to find out whether Volkswagen were going to be doing cheap deals and whether they were going to be cutting their prices and so forth. So searches went through the roof, but not necessarily in a good way. And during the scandal, the relationship between search and market share broke down. Only temporarily, but for a period of a few months, those two metrics were going in opposite directions. And we've seen the same thing in other categories. So in mobile telephony, BlackBerry had a period when there was a lot of search activity, which I think related to negative PR. I think it may have been to do with bad company results, for instance. And share of search went up and share of market went down. And we also saw some similar things in energy, where bad publicity about rising energy prices led to increased search behavior for some brands, but reduced market share. So this is a problem. You're going to have situations where the relationship breaks down. It's not perfect. There will always be other factors. So this is not, as somebody pointed out, the one metric to rule them all. You do have to interpret the data with intelligence and caution. It may be possible in the future to produce a more sophisticated search metric which takes account of the reasons why people are searching, whether they're positive searches or negative searches. One company I know of is experimenting with combining search data with social media data to get an idea of like, are people talking about the brand in a good or a bad way, and therefore is this positive share of search or negative share of search? That might improve things. I think that's a fruitful avenue for future research. The other factor that really affects things is conversion between search and sales. Now, of course, I believe that share of search is a measure of the interest in the brand at the top of the funnel. You know, when people are first beginning to think about the brand, and maybe even some way before they're going to buy. Certainly, you know, if we see searches a year ahead of purchase, that this is clearly at the very beginning of the customer journey. But a lot happens between those initial searches and final buying behavior. Google recently published a very useful report, which I'd recommend you read, called Decoding Decisions, where they talk about how people come to the internet with preconceptions about which brands they're interested in. They do exploratory research, which often changes that. And then in the final furlong, when they're finalizing the decision, a lot can then happen to change their mind. And they call that the messy middle. Their messy middle research shows that the brands that people are interested in before they go online, those initial preferences are really, really important. Even in today's digital age, brands do matter, even when you're buying things online. But also the conversion process matters. So the conversion process is affected by all sorts of things, by physical availability for a start. You know, just how easy is it to buy the product? You can be really interested and search for a brand, but if it's not available in your area, you're not going to buy it. There's all the tricks of the trade of shopper marketing and digital marketing and performance marketing, which affect things. And there's also price, which is massively, massively important. You can see the price effect in the car market here. So what we've done here is, on the y-axis, created a conversion metric. This is share of search divided by share of sales. So it's, if you like, the conversion from one to the other. And we compared that against the relative price of each brand. And lo and behold, there's a very clear negative relationship between these two things. Expensive brands have low conversion rates. Cheap brands have higher conversion rates. The shape of this relationship is a curve which looks very much like the classical demand curve that economists are so fond of. In a sense, what share of search enables you to do here is to map the demand curve. And I think that too is a very interesting application of the technique. What it's allowing you to do here is to say, okay, if we wanted to improve our conversion from interest to purchase, how much would we have to reduce our price? So if your share of search data can be used as a leading indicator for where your market share will go next, then this kind of demand curve mapping could then tell you what to do about it. You see a slump in searches, which means a slump in demand coming up. It might tell you how much you need to cut your prices. And equally, if you see a surge in demand coming up, it might tell you how much you can raise your prices. That's, you know, this is theoretical. I haven't done it, but I mean, I think that's potentially an interesting thing that a marketer could try. It could be particularly useful in the world of e-commerce, for example, where you can have dynamic pricing. And then if you interrogate this chart in slightly more detail, then you can see that some brands sit slightly differently relative to the demand curve. For example, look at Alfa Romeo. It sits way below the demand curve. It has a low conversion from search to sales for its price. Why is that? Well, one possibility might be physical availability, distribution. Perhaps there aren't so many Alfa Romeo dealers in the UK. And so maybe Alfa Romeos are just a bit trickier for people to get hold of. But it might reflect some other part of the conversion process. Maybe there is something about the customer journey that's going wrong for Alfa Romeo there. Conversely, for example, you can see that Mercedes does pretty well at converting for its price, slightly better, for example, than BMW, which is similarly priced. What is Mercedes doing right that allows them to slightly outperform BMW here? And why does Hyundai do so ridiculously well at converting from search to share compared to other brands that are at a similar price point, like, say, for example, Citroën or Seat? These are interesting questions. This is the kind of data you can use to begin to interrogate these questions. Now let's go back to energy and less planned purchases. One criticism that people were quick to raise about my research in automotive and mobile is those are not representative categories. They're, high consideration, high interest, low frequency purchase. They're durables. What about other things like, FMCG and more commoditized categories? Well, the only one that I've looked at in detail is energy. I have looked at other categories in less formal detail without using econometrics, but today I'm focusing on the categories where I have chapter and verse and detailed mathematical measurement. So in energy, it is slightly more complicated. Share of search does lead market share in energy. It is a leading indicator, but it's a much shorter lag. Shorter lead. And what we find is that in energy, price plays a massive role. This is a highly commodified category. People are mostly searching for cheap deals. The role of brand is a lot smaller. It does play a role, but it's a lot smaller. That means that actually forecasting, using share of search as a forecasting tool is just not practical in the energy sector, because you just cannot forecast what your competitors are going to do in terms of price. Prices are dynamically changing in real time, and therefore you can't actually forecast accurately this way. And I would expect that to be similar in any category where it's highly price sensitive and prices are changing dynamically. So things like, for example, car insurance, and the kinds of products that people buy on price comparison sites. Nevertheless, share of search, I think, is still a very important metric for those sorts of brands, because share of search tells you how interested people are in your brand at the top of the funnel, at the beginning of the consumer journey. It tells you the extent to which people are looking for your brand, rather than just looking for sort of energy or car insurance in general. If people are searching for your brand of car insurance rather than just car insurance, they're more likely to go straight to your website, and then you're less likely to be involved in a furious price war. Whereas if people just search on a generic term like car insurance, then you're more likely to end up as a price comparison site and end up having to fight with other brands on price. So even for these commoditized brands, I think share of search is a useful measure of the demand at the top of the funnel and the extent to which you're likely to have to compete on price. So I think it's still relevant. And James will talk about actually using this in things like FMCG, where it's still useful. So let me summarize what I've said in the first part. I think that share of search appears to be a leading indicator for market share. For many brands, it's at least correlated with market share. And for many brands, it could be a leading indicator with perhaps predictive power. I think that makes it a useful indicator of the latent demand for a brand, rather like perhaps brand consideration. But unlike where conventional tracking metrics, it's much quicker to compile. You can get it in almost real time, and it's free. So, you know, that's got to be good, hasn't it? And therefore, it may be a useful metric to help evaluate brand building activity over the longer term. For some brands, it will be an alternative to tracking, you know, for perhaps those brands that don't have the budget for tracking. For the bigger brands, it's likely to be a complement to conventional tracking research. I believe it's a measure of interest in the brand at the top of the purchase funnel, but how that converts to actual sales depends on other factors like supply, distribution, and so on. I think it could be used to give an early warning of the way in which demand is changing, and that might then inform things like your pricing and your other more tactical activities that help convert as you go down the funnel. It's not perfect. There are problems with bad PR and bad publicity. We might be able to improve it by adding in, for example, some kind of measure of sentiment. So that's share of search as a brand metric. But the next question is, what drives share of searches? And that's what I want to talk about in part 2, where I talk about share of search as an advertising metric. But now I'm going to shut up and I'm going to let you ask me some questions.